This program is a presentation of University of California Television. Your support makes UCTV's programming possible. Contribute online at uctv.tv/support. Check out our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, at youtube.com/UCTV Prime. Subscribe today to get new programs every week.
Thanks everyone for attending our fourth installment of Sit Down with Sabin. My name is Dan Krotz with Public Affairs. Sit Down with Sabin is a weekly conversation in which Sabin Russell, seated here, engages lab staff about their research. It's been a while since we've had our last one. It's about a 3-week break, and today you'll hear the latest thinking on what it takes to get people to consider energy efficiency in their everyday lives. We also certainly want to hear from you, so there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. Please wait for a microphone because we're videoing this, and we'll send a microphone to you if you have your hand up during the Q&A portion. Because it has been a little while, I'll reintroduce our moderator, Sabin Russell. He joined Berkeley Lab last year after a long career as a Bay Area health and science reporter. This included 22 years at the San Francisco Chronicle, freelance work with the New York Times, and a fellowship at MIT as a Night Science Journalism Fellow. He's best known for his work covering HIV in the US and Africa. He's also covered a whole range of other topics, including the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster and the tsunami in Sri Lanka. Today, you can find him both moderating Sit Down with Sabin, and as the lead writer and editor in the Creative Services Office, where he can help you on a variety of projects concerning web content and writing. So if you have any projects for him, feel free to get to him after the talk. And without any further ado, I'll now hand the stage over to Sabin for the fourth installment. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan, and thank all of you for coming. This is our fourth in a series of experiments on a new format for the lab. I've been here 1 year, and some of you have heard this spiel before, but some of you there's some new faces here as well. So I wanted to tell you briefly why we're doing this. I'm extremely impressed with the diversity of sciences at this lab. They talk here about how we explore both the infinite and the infinitesimal. We have the nanotechnologists at the Molecular Foundry, and we have the cosmologists just down the hall. We work on high energy physics here, and we also learn how to save energy at Energy Technologies, Environmental Energy and Technologies. And today, our presentation is going to be a little bit different. We often talk to people who are bench scientists, and today we're going to be talking about energy conservation almost from a marketing standpoint, looking at the social science of marketing. I wanted to when you think about the bench work that goes on here, we think about how people are trying to coax a few extra watts out of a photovoltaic panel, or find a new source of biofuel that will help us save energy or save fossil fuels. Here we're going to be talking about how to coax energy savings from a different source, which is human beings. How do you convince human beings to save energy? And it's actually a very fundamental question and a very important one. It may be more important in the long run than whether we can get a few extra watts out of a photovoltaic panel. And so, as I say, we're going to be talking not about physics so much here as perhaps behavioral science, the science of marketing, and what's sometimes called the dismal science, economics. But we have here one of the brightest lights at the lab to discuss these issues. Her name is Marian Fuller, and she is a principal research associate at EETD. She got her BA at Stanford. She got kind of a joint master's in energy and environment at Cal. At the same time, she got her MBA at the Haas School of Business. She did some clean energy work in Philadelphia and Vermont. And when the DOE needed to put together a panel to help cities and towns understand some of the finances of, get some financial assistance for energy projects during the stimulus program, Marian was on that panel. So I want to welcome Marian Fuller. Let's give her a warm welcome to the lab. So Marian, we're going to be talking about how you basically get people to buy in to energy efficiency. And I thought it would be useful at the start of this to maybe just define our terms. I've heard the term comprehensive home energy improvement. I think that seems to be the area where we're going to be focusing on in terms of your research and your findings. So tell us a little bit, what exactly is comprehensive home energy improvement?
Yep, so just to put it in context, we're focused a lot on buildings. Buildings are about 40% of our energy use, 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot of the programs we've had to date have been pretty surface level. You might say 1%, 2% of total energy use in an individual building or home. And what we're saying, what the DOE is saying as well, is we need to get to 15% savings, 20% savings, 50, more than that. In California, we're talking about net zero energy buildings. Mm-hmm. And so what that looks like in a home is you're looking at all the systems. And for an individual residential home, you'll be sealing that home so all the cool air or hot air that you're using electricity or gas to produce isn't escaping. So insulation to also increase kind of the building shell's ability to maintain all that heated or cooled air. You're going to be replacing lighting system. You're often going to be making pretty large changes to your heating or air conditioning systems as well. Either going to a much more efficient air conditioning unit, let's say, or going from a gas heater to a ductless heat pump that's much, much more efficient in terms of electricity that it transfers into making that cool air or that hot air.
Is there any way to sort of quantify, on average, say for the country, how much energy savings or perhaps dollar savings might be attained by this strategy? Yeah,
well, in terms of the programs I work with, we're shooting for a minimum of 15% energy savings in homes. 15%. Yep. The potential is far greater than that. I think without a lot of problem, overwhelming amount of investment, people can save easily 30, maybe even up to 40% of their energy use. Mm-hmm. And in climates where it's really cold or really hot or both, the savings, the money savings especially, is even greater than in a more mild climate.
What would be the kind of dollar range we're talking about?
Well, the average bill in the U.S. to a homeowner is about $150, $200. So if you're talking 15% of that, you can do the math. It's $15 to $50 a month that we're talking about in savings. And in places where it's very cold, they use heating oil, all sorts of things. They can be spending, or even air conditioning in the Central Valley. We have people who spend literally thousands of dollars every month for heating large, really inefficient homes. The savings then get even more robust.
So we're sort of defining the solution here. I think that people sometimes use the term low-hanging fruit in terms of some of the easiest things that can be done for a big benefit in energy savings. And yet the actual performance out there is not so good. The success has been limited, right? Yeah. I mean, in a sense, here we may have just defined the term there, but here we're defining the problem. The problem is that this very valuable kind of activity that I think everybody in this room understands and perhaps even believes in hasn't been adopted. Yeah. How badly are we doing?
Well, I mean, Secretary Chu has called energy efficiency the fruit on the ground. Like, you don't even have to reach up and pick it. It's there, it's on the ground.
It's on the ground.
And at the same time, when you think about buildings, all the decision makers involved in buildings, and then having to say yes, get the assessment to their building or their home, go through the process of having the contractors come in and do that work, making the payments for those, in some cases convincing their landlord or the building owner to make those improvements if they're a tenant. It can get very complex, and it has a lot to do with motivation, who's motivated to do what, and less about just simple dollars and cents. If it's about simple dollars and cents, this would have already happened. But it's about these transaction costs and these human factors. So a lot of the programs that I've looked at have reached less than 0.5% of their targeted population in a given year. So if you think about needing to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions or wanting to reduce pressure on the grid, those sorts of things, we have to get way beyond that to actually make an impact.
And so I gather that much of your work is in sort of analyzing the factors that might, in one way or another, influence people to consider this more seriously, to increase those numbers. And although we don't allow PowerPoints at our presentations, we do allow props. And I believe that you brought a prop.
I brought a couple props. If I can reach them.
Let's go with the blue one first.
The blue one first. Okay, well, this is a report. It's driving demand for home energy improvements, a very exciting 130-page read.
Available free on the web.
Available free on the web at drivingdemand.lbl.gov, super easy to remember. And we also have like 2-page handouts that you can just like skim that will give you the key points. And so part of what we did with the report is try to make it a lot more accessible to as many audiences as possible. There's a 30-minute video you can watch and hear me talk about this work. We've had almost 400,000 people download this report since last September. So it's gotten a lot of...
That is more people than have downloaded Sit Down with Saban by now.
But with this report, what we really tried to do is look at what have we learned from past programs, both in terms of the penetration rates, the number of people we've gotten to participate in programs, but also what are the creative things that people are doing to get the attention of homeowners, the decision makers, who need to say yes, need to sign on the dotted line, need to make some personal investment for us to be able to get to the type of savings levels that I've mentioned already.
Well, I gather that the core of this report is that you did a number of case studies. And these are case studies that of programs that took place over the last 30 years, and not just the more recent ones. I think we'll want to talk specifics in a little bit, but what are some of the take-home messages? You know, in terms of what works and what does not work? Are there a couple of like key findings that may even be counterintuitive?
Yep. I think the top two that we saw again and again and again is, number one, you have to engage trusted messengers to talk to the people you're trying to reach. So historically, a lot of programs have come at it as the local government, as the utility, and said, hey, I have a new message for you. In addition to paying your energy bill, I also now want you to do all these other things for us. It's going to help the world, help you, et cetera. And it was a messenger that wasn't reaching the audience. So you really have to use groups, individuals, nonprofits, schools, et cetera, that those folks already trust, already relate to, are already listening to in various formats, as opposed to coming in totally new, totally fresh, and asking someone to do something. If you think about all the messages we get every day to buy stuff, to change behavior in various ways, you can see like the budgets that we have for efficiency just do not compare to the budgets that Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola and other large companies have to influence us, to get us to pay attention. And so it really takes some personal connections, a trusted messenger to get people to actually take action.
Well, I think I've heard you speak about sort of common myths that people have about how you persuade people to buy into energy. What are some of those myths? And one of my secret vices is I like this show called Mythbusters. And so let's bust a few myths here.
Yeah, so the two myths that I hear all the time, especially from policymakers who've been told this is a low-hanging fruit for years and years, is one that if people have access to information, they'll behave differently. And in the social science literature, behavioral psychology, this again and again, just because you believe something hypothetically doesn't mean you're going to spend $5,000, have a contractor come in your home, do a bunch of work you don't yet understand. So that's a big one. It's not just saying, oh, this is going to save you money, and then hordes will kind of flock to do this work. The second one is that capital is the problem. That because it costs more than a few bucks, you might need to spend $5,000, let's say. A lot of policymakers are saying all we need is financing. If you just give people access to capital, they'll be able to do this work. They'll do the calculation in their head, cash flow positive, return on investment is great, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out that's not the way people think. And most people don't want loans for things they don't yet want, right? So if you want a car, a loan to buy that car is great. But if you don't yet want insulation, a loan is not going to be what drives you to get that insulation in your house. You have to want it first, and then financing just offers a way to make that possible for you. So those are the two big ones that we see a lot.
I guess I've heard advertising described as sort of the art of persuading people to want something that they don't need. Here we're trying to persuade people that they need something they don't really want.
Yeah.
Is there? Are there? Let's talk a little bit about your analysis of some projects that took place in the field, where. Because what you're describing to me sounds like almost an insoluble problem.
Fortunately not. But
if you give people information and you make money available, and that's not going to do the trick.
Yeah.
What more do you need to sell something that makes as much sense as saving money on energy?
Well, part of it is that the way we're selling it is not effective. So if someone's paying, let's say they're paying $200 a month on their electricity bill, on their total utility bill, and you say you can save 20%, and they're like, $40 a month, whoopee, like that may not be what is actually enough to get them to make the investment we're talking about. So when you actually talk to contractors in the field who are working with people every day, getting them to actually do this work, what they tell me is that you have to solve a problem they already have. So, for example, a contractor went to one customer, and they're like, my daughter's bedroom is freezing, and the rest of the house is overheating. And he was able to both solve that problem, sort of the distribution of airflow in the house, and put in a ton of insulation, a much more efficient heating system, and lower their energy bills significantly.
So that's interesting. You spoke about trusted messengers. Sometimes I don't think of contractors as people I particularly trust.
Yeah.
But in point of fact, we all deal with them. We know how hard their work is, and you're saying that the contractors are the people to work through.
Huge. So I think in terms of, we were talking earlier about the two big lessons. One is trusted messengers, and the other one is contractors. And having contractors know how to sell. A lot of the programs I work with have done technical training forever, and they're finally starting to train contractors to talk to people, to actually be able to communicate these usually foreign concepts to folks who have a cold bedroom or experiencing drafts, or they have a really high air conditioning bill in the summer because they live in Sacramento. So actually addressing those problems and being able to communicate about what's going on in their homes in a way that is not alienating, it makes sense, is actually compelling.
So you're talking about this sell, or making the sale, almost, it seems to me, in terms of very detailed, down-to-earth, real-life scenarios, as opposed to maybe preaching at somebody that you shoulda, oughta save energy, or that that we have some money available, or you can do this, this, and this. Here you're talking about kind of closing the deal at the kitchen table.
Yes. That key decision point. And I have to say, money on the table helps. So programs around the country, including here, are offering big rebates. California, you can get up to $4,000 to do this work in your home right now. that helps. That definitely gets people's attention.
Yeah.
And it makes it easier for the contractor to make that deal. They could say things like, well, this rebate is only going to last for the next year. Make a move now. But in terms of the contractor in the home, making that sale at the kitchen table, that is where the decision point happens. And if they're able to use an infrared camera where they can actually see where the panel of insulation is missing in their wall, or can see the cracks around their windows, or whatever other leakage that they have in their house, they can actually visualize that. That helps.
So there are some tools.
There are some
gimmicks.
tools. Yep.
Gimmicks, not gadgets. Gadgets, not gimmicks.
Yes.
Which reminds me,
Yeah.
you brought for show and tell something else.
Yeah, this is a really simple tool. It's called a kilowatt. All you do is plug this into one of your outlets. You plug whatever device you want into it. So we, for example, use this with a refrigerator. We had a really old refrigerator. We had no idea how old or how inefficient it was. We could plug that in, and we can find both the instantaneous power that it was using and over time, what its cycles were. So over 24 hours, we can find out how many kilowatt hours it was using.
And it's called kill-a-watt.
Kilowatt.
Get it?
Yep.
Yeah. So this is now. Is this a tool that a contractor would bring into a home, or would somebody buy this and feed this information to a contractor?
Both. Okay. A lot of energy nerds like myself like these, and they're like, oh, how much does this use? How much does this use? I don't see this as becoming a mass market device.
How much will that set me back?
$10. I don't.
$10
It's cheap. I don't even know.
Okay.
But yeah, it's pretty cheap. And they have much more sophisticated devices now. You can have a little clamp just on your main meter and watch your energy use over time. There's other devices now where you can plug it into multiple sockets and measure different zones of your house, so you can actually see where you're wasting energy.
Well, we hear a little bit in California about the smart meter program at PG&E.
Yeah.
Does that program, in fact, provide the kind of information that could be useful to either the contractor or the consumer at home?
Yeah, it definitely provides more detailed information to the utility about where energy is being used. And in a number of pilots that actually PG&E and a few others are doing, they actually use it to compare your energy use versus others in your neighborhood. So that's actually getting at behavioral insight of using social norms to influence behavior. So they give you a bill and you see yourself, you see your neighbor, your average neighbor energy use, and you see like the more efficient neighbor. And ideally, you're more than those, right? So that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm really, I'm not normal. I need to reduce my energy use. And they usually then include a bunch of ways that you might do that.
So it makes it a little less abstract if you actually have some data to indicate that you really are getting somewhere. I mean, I guess it's sort of like driving your Prius and looking at the dashboard and seeing that you're running on electricity right now.
Yeah, and getting that feedback when you actually make improvements too is really important for maintaining interest.
So, if I'm not mistaken, some of the case studies that are outlined in this very book, available free on the web, talk about outright competitions.
Yeah.
In Boston, there's a smackdown.
Yeah, the energy smackdown.
Smackdown. How'd that work?
That had households competing against each other in multiple challenges. They both had an overall energy use, they were measuring those homes' energy use, about 100 households, how they competed over time, over about a one year period. But they also had individual challenges. They actually went to one person's house in each of the 3 teams that were competing and did insulation and air sealing. Within a 3-hour period, they had to try to reduce all the air filtration that was leaving that house, and competed against each other to do that.
Actually competing in speed of installation.
So you had 3 hours, as much air leakage as you could stop in that 3 hours. Whoever did the best job won, sort of thing. Yeah.
Now, was that program considered successful?
I think so. That one was particularly expensive to run just because of the kind of hand-holding all those households had to do. But there are other programs that have more kind of general, broader competitions, let's say between towns. And so the other example of that in the report is one in Kansas, where literally they had towns in Kansas competing against each other for total energy use changes.
Kansas does not strike me offhand as a state that, where energy efficiency, energy efficiency sounds vaguely left-wing.
Well, it turns out it can appeal to all audiences, and it also depends on how you message it, right? So in Kansas, they weren't saying you're going to save the earth, be green, join Obama in the campaign to reduce energy use. They were saying your town is competing against that town over there, and we want to make sure that we're better than them in a friendly way. And they also created these steering committees of local leaders, the folks in the town who everyone respected, the guy who owned the radio station, the woman who was on the school board, the person who had all the really most popular restaurants in town. Those guys were actually the face of the program.
And these are your trusted messengers?
These are the trusted messengers.
Trusted messengers, okay.
Yeah. Yep. And so they decided, there was money from the outside coming in through a local nonprofit in Kansas, and they on the ground though got to decide how would it be most effective to use this money. Was it a street fair? Was it a party at the local restaurant? What are the different ways? There's 2 towns that had rival football teams. They had a particularly great rivalry going on, and they were able to get people's attention because of the competition. They also had messages around just being sensible. Like you need to save energy. There's no reason for us to waste resources. It's just not a practical, sensible thing to do. And there's lots of other reasons besides climate change, besides environment, to do efficiency work. So that's been a really successful program. And actually, we have the lab is actually hosting Nancy Jackson, who is one of the leaders of that effort in Kansas, on October 3rd at the Berkeley Rep. So if you're interested in that program and hearing more about their experiences on the town, how they were able to communicate what was important about that program, get people engaged.
Is this the Science in the Theater program?
That's right.
Excellent.
Yep. October 3rd.
October 3rd. Don't miss it.
Yeah.
So. I'm curious, though. This is such an interesting example, Kansas. Were these super rural communities, or were they some of the urban areas of Kansas?
It was towns, so it wasn't the largest metro areas in Kansas. So smaller towns in Kansas. Yep.
And is there any way to quantify any? Are there results in yet, or partial results? How they?
Actually, I don't know they definitely saved energy. I think it was around a 5% savings, but my memory is failing me. One interesting thing is that because they did it while the recession was in progress, most places in the U.S. or many places in the U.S. reduced their energy use just because of economic activity being down. And so what they did is they had one kind of control town and one competition town, and they were similar in size, similar in energy use, and they looked at what that control town's energy use did in the last year compared to the competition town and subtracted those. So anything related to the recession, to just the conditions of that last year, even weather has a big impact. They tried to get rid of that and really isolate what was due to the competition.
And are there any numbers to toss around, like milliwatts or kilowatts?
Actually, I don't remember the exact numbers. I think it was around 5% total energy use, and they got thousands of new lighting fixtures installed, a bunch of upgrades done.
So this is considered sort of a success.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Well, I'm a former newspaper guy, kind of negative, so I can't help but asking, any of these programs not work very well? I mean, we sort of know what works. Did we find any programs that maybe were less than successful?
There's a lot of programs that are less than successful, at least less than I'd like to see them be.
What sort of mistakes, or what are the lessons learned?
A lot of what we focused on, just because of interest by DOE and others, is financing programs. So programs that just offer a loan product, like I was saying earlier, is not enough to actually motivate people. And so there's literally, if you look in the database they have online for this, there's 150 energy efficiency loan programs out there. Tiny participation rates for most of them.
Really?
And that's because they just offer the product, they maybe include it in your utility bill insert, and they expect magic to happen, and it just doesn't. It takes much more than that to motivate people.
You've mentioned in conversations I've had with you how important language is in communicating things like this. And one of the things that intrigued me is you were talking about how simple terms like an energy audit, which is what I would think of when a contractor comes in, does some tests, that's not a good term. And that even the term retrofit, what's wrong with those terms, and what would you prefer, and is there any science behind that, or is this just your feeling, you don't like those words?
Yeah, well, it is a fuzzy science always in terms of language and what works and who's motivated by what. But I think we do know that people have mental frames that have meaning, or in some cases not, that words are attached to these frames that have a meaning. And that as much as possible, you don't want to have to create new words, new language, new meaning for people. You want to tap into something that they already understand, they relate it to something positive, they relate it to the types of things that you want them to associate it with. So when we talk about the word audit, maybe in this room everyone's like, an audit, yeah, an energy audit, I'm really up for that, that sounds exciting. Most people think like IRS, I would not pay for that in a million years, and it just doesn't resonate.
When are they going to find out?
It doesn't mean much, or it doesn't have a positive meaning. Same thing with retrofit. In general, we actually had a behavioral scientist look at all the words that we're using through DOE programs, and he was like, retrofit, what does that even mean? It just doesn't have any attachment, or it's like backwards in the future, sort of retro. And so we need to use language that has some meaning for people. So I think, not backed up by extensive analysis or research, because it's very hard to do that type of research, that using something like home energy improvements, where you're connecting to making improvements to your home, something that people are already familiar with, is good. Home energy improvements, home energy upgrades. Folks are using things, instead of audit, saying an assessment, home checkup. I like the idea of thinking about efficiency in terms of the miles per gallon for your home. People are already tuned into that for cars. So it taps into a frame that already makes sense to them, that's very relevant. Okay, we buy more efficient cars now, gas is expensive. Of course it makes sense to have a more efficient home.
So is there any work on a metric for a more efficient home?
There is actually some really interesting work right now that's trying to label and being able to compare homes to one another. So in Europe and Australia, they actually already have multiple, they have labeling systems, and many homes are actually required to get a label so that when you buy a home, you actually know how does it compare, what am I buying? Because you don't have the utility bills in most cases in advance.
Well, my icebox has an Energy Star label.
Yep. Energy
Star developed at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory.
Yeah, and that is one of the most well-recognized brands in efficiency. It's super successful.
Is there any way to create an Energy Star rating for a house, for instance?
So what we're doing right now is the DOE is piloting something called the Home Energy Score. And it has multiple bars, 1 through 10, where your home falls on that, and compares you to everyone else in the country, and kind of you to what your home could be based on the metrics they collect on that home. And we're trying that out right now. And actually, folks at the lab have been really involved in that pilot, and really involved in the back end assessment of how you actually get to that score, what information you need to put in to come to that ultimate score.
You said something I think I saw on a video of one of your presentations. You're on the lecture circuit a lot, it seems, talking about losses and gains, and people respond differently to that.
Yeah.
Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so this is one of the sort of insights from behavioral science that we think is really important when talking to people about improvements in their home. So people tend to be more sensitive to losses than to gains. And so a specific example is they're more sensitive to losing $5,000 to pay for this upgrade than they are to the $50 a month that they're going to gain supposedly in energy savings.
Well, maybe they're just good at math. I mean,
well, a lot of times with efficiency, it actually pencils out quite well.
It does.
But we have a hard time aggregating benefits in the future and really fully valuing them, in dollars today. It's something that's hard for our brains to do. And most people are not taking out their pen and paper. And we're used to buying services, a little bit at a time. So for example, if you had to pay for all your cell phone minutes for the next 10 years today, that's going to be pretty painful, as opposed to spending like $200 a month, or the insane rates that we had to pay for cell phones. So when we talk about paying for all of our savings for the next 10 years for a house in one lump sum, way less appealing than paying a little bit at a time, right? And that's part of the reason that financing is going to be of interest once people want to do these improvements.
Let's go back to some of your some of the case studies that you talked about. There was one in Massachusetts that kind of interested me, because I think the participation level there was mind-blowing. You were talking about getting 5% participation sometimes, and if I'm not mistaken, this was close to 70%.
Yep.
What were they doing right?
Well, there's a number of programs that have gotten kind of above 50%, and it's usually a combination of things. So in that case, really great door-to-door, like your neighbors are engaged, the community leaders are engaged, it's everywhere, you can't miss it, so it kind of hits people in the face. And that becomes a social norming thing. You know, some of the programs I work with, every single home that they do upgrades to, they put a sign in the front, and it's like, gee, what, you know, we participated, why didn't you? Is kind of the message on most of them. So that sort of social norming piece. Guilt. Making you feel like you're not part of the group. That makes us uncomfortable. They also, in many cases, provided really large subsidies. So programs that pay for all or a big chunk of the cost are more successful. Like, that's not a surprise, but it's actually in combination with kind of these behavioral-based techniques that you get the highest participation rates.
Now, one of the things that struck me about that was that this particular community in Massachusetts was kind of an upscale community. It was, I don't know, it might have even been a wealthy community. And that's something that I kind of wrestle with on energy efficiency is energy efficiency a little bit of a luxury item? Not so much a luxury item, but something for people who, for instance, can afford a Prius. Not everybody can afford a Prius. Is energy efficiency only going to work for people who have the bucks to assuage their guilt?
Well, I think this is really problematic, actually. So in the US, we have programs that address the bottom third in terms of income with free programs. And those programs were boosted by Recovery Act dollars, but are nowhere near large enough to actually meet the need of the kind of the bottom third. And we're talking about folks with household incomes less than $30,000 a year. Right, so a $5,000 improvement is kind of insane in that context. And then you have all the, above $30,000 a year household, they are able to participate in these market rate programs that we're doing a lot of work on. And what we're seeing is that most of the folks who are participating, especially in the financing programs, have really high credit ratings. So while income is not directly correlated to credit, there's certainly some relationship there. And so our assumption, and we've kind of talked to a lot of program managers now, we know that it is wealthier people that tend to be participating more. They also tend to be bigger energy hogs, so they actually have greater savings in some cases. However, we're doing research right now in my group looking at moderate income families. So, $30,000 to $60,000 a year. What do these folks look like? Turns out they mostly live in single family homes. They mostly own their own home. In the past, they've done a ton of home improvements. About a third of the whole population, about a third of the home improvements have been made in those buildings. So they're active participants in doing home improvements. But a lot of that has been based on borrowing home equity lines because they had value left in their home. And what we're seeing now is those folks have less equity, way less access to credit, and also much higher financial instability. So they're wanting to save more, they're less willing to make these investments. So we're doing research right now looking at how do you offer additional support to these moderate income families to make sure that they are guaranteed savings to some degree, that they have more access to credit, that they have different ways. Maybe you offer them some additional incentives. You pay for half of the project costs and then finance the rest. So we're looking at ways right now of how we might better able to meet that middle income market, because they do use a ton of energy. They could definitely benefit from those savings, and they aren't getting access probably as much as these other groups.
Before we open it up to the floor for questions, so think about your questions. Another thing I was wondering about is, here we are in California, where it's 60 degrees outside, and you flip on the news, and half the country's baking over 100 degrees. And we like to take a certain amount of pride in the fact that we're leading the world in some ways in energy efficiency in California. Is that because our energy policies are better, or is it just simply that we have the gift of this incredible climate and we don't face the kinds of energy issues that other places do, that perhaps their problems are more real than ours?
Yeah. So our climate actually hurts us more than helps us. We use far less energy, in most cases, especially in the Bay Area with a pretty moderate climate, than a lot of other places. If you go, certainly Central Valley has a lot of cooling issues, but as you get up into the northern parts of the country or the southern parts of the country, they have heating and cooling issues in many places where they have hot summers and cold winters. way higher potential for savings in those zones. So we
so
actually have less potential for savings.
So there's more to be gained in these
dollars.
places that are having a rough time with their climate.
Yeah, and we also have invested consistently in efficiency. So, and we have higher electricity prices, which is another benefit to efficiency programs here. The dollars do pencil out better here than, let's say, in the Pacific Northwest, where they have really cheap hydropower, or in other parts of the country where they have really cheap coal power. Yeah.
Very interesting. I would like to open it up to the floor. I'll still be asking some questions down here, but we have folks with microphones, and if you just raise your hand, we'll call you out, and we'd love to hear your questions.
As you know, most utilities offer rate programs to residences that are tier-based, and most rate payers don't really understand those too well, and there's many academics and others think that dynamic pricing that actually better reflects the actual cost of production of electricity would be a better way for people to actually change their behavior based on the actual cost of electricity. As it changes in the hot summer afternoons, for example, it might be more expensive. Yet, in general, there's been resistance to that by many consumer groups. So I'd like you to comment on your thoughts on dynamic pricing.
Yeah, so dynamic pricing has a lot of potential for sure, and there's actually folks at the lab doing research on it right now with the DOE. There's actually a report that came out, I think it was yesterday, with a utility in Texas that showed that folks significantly reduced their energy use as a result of dynamic pricing, and part of it was just knowing when they're using energy. The problem is that you have to constantly have people be aware of it, unless you have appliances that are smart appliances and somehow know to turn off at certain hours and turn on at certain hours, which can work really well, but we haven't figured all that out yet. So just so everyone knows, if you use energy between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock, it's way more expensive for the utility to procure it because there's so much more demand in those hours. So they're turning on really expensive sort of peak generating units. It would be great, financially and also environmentally to avoid that. And so anything we can do to have people better understand energy use, I think is great. However, I think that especially individual homeowners' attention spans are pretty small. And my guess is that you might have some interest at first, and maybe you'll develop some habits that are maintained, but to get people to pay attention super closely over a longer period of time might be difficult. But it may start to be a norm, okay, I'm just not going to turn anything on until 6 p.m. because I know that that's when the peak happens. In terms of the tiers that we have now in California, where as you use more, it costs more per unit, it definitely makes efficiency projects look better. It definitely makes solar projects look better. A lot of the solar installers that I've talked to, it's that's where they sell to the people who are paying 20, 30 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 12 on the low end because they're up in these higher energy uses. So it certainly is effective for selling things to the right people, but it's not something that people already know about. Yeah.
Another question in the back of the room?
Hi. So I know that you're talking about people having to invest all this capital initially to improve energy efficiency in their homes, and I know that one incentive that's often used is mentioning to people that there will be a break-even point in the future. So I was wondering if you could give us a rough estimate. If you wanted to invest to achieve that 15% reduction, what would the break-even time be versus if you wanted to achieve a 50% reduction?
Oh, that's harder. 50% is harder. But I can give you a sense. So in this climate zone, I actually just had a home energy assessment, and we did a simple calculation. It's going to be about 10 and a half years before we break even, and that's after the incentives that we're getting cost. We're really low energy users relative for the area. In other places where electricity is either more expensive or they're much higher energy users, so 30% of a $1,000 bill is going to be way different than saving 30% on a $200 bill. In those places, you could, I think 3 to 10 years for residential home energy is probably reasonable to expect. And just depending on your energy use, the cost of your energy, and the leakiness of your home, you're going to be on the lower end if those things are in your favor.
What a question right here.
Hey, Marian. I have 2 questions. So the first is I wonder if you could speak to the role you see mobile technology and also social media playing in this. I've heard of a number of projects that are looking at developing iPhone apps that are games or push notifications, things like that. And then the other one is what you think the role or the effectiveness of educational outreach through younger generations might be in this, and whether there's any, I don't know if there's any data or on the effectiveness of that in changing behaviors. So educating people that are going to be homeowners in 10, 15 years, and also getting to their parents through children.
Yep, great questions. And I don't think we have any conclusions on those questions yet, but I do know that many of the successful programs are using various forms of social media. They might have, every program I work with now has a Facebook page, but some of them actually send out like regular updates. There's actually a program that I've been looking at that has you compete against other customers in your utility area for doing different tasks, so you get points for different activities. And I think that will appeal to a certain segment of the population. I've yet to see a social media technology like take off and be able to point to it in any sort of mass way, but I think especially for certain parts of the population that will be appealing. On the educating the younger generation, we don't have great data yet, but a lot of folks are looking at the recycling campaigns in the last 20 years, and that did have a very significant impact. They were able to look at that over time. And so a number of places now, all over the country really, and the EPA and DOE are also supporting this, looking at curriculum where it's making energy efficiency and all sorts of sort of sustainable, reducing water use, reducing garbage production more easy, and having kids encourage their parents to actually do new behaviors. There's one program in Marian where they actually have a little coupon book, and for every activity that they get their parents to do, they get to have a coupon, and it adds up to some prize they get, and it goes along with a kind of fun curriculum that's in the classroom. There's a program in Boulder where they actually bring in cartoon characters that are what is it? Anyway, there's like superhero, basically, characters that have songs and other things that get younger kids, in elementary school to think about these things, be engaged, and even do, audits, assessments of their own house to figure out where the savings are. So, and another example actually is in terms of trusted messengers, Alameda County is actually trying out a program where schools, if the more parents they get in their schools to participate, they can actually get paid per parent, and that goes into a general school fund. And then there's a prize at the end of the year where for each parent they get goes into a lottery, and they can win $10,000 that will pay for books and other sort of supplies that school needs. So they're trying to see is schools and through kids a good way to reach parents. And I think it seems to be, but there's not any great data on that yet.
Marian, in a lot of marketing research that I'm aware of, there's a term that comes up a lot when you're trying to bring out something new, which is, I think it's called early adopter. You talk about needing to know who your target audience is.
Yeah.
Who are the early adopters, and are they right now the target audience for something that is still kind of a relatively new concept in this country, even though it's been around for a long time, clearly with a relatively low rate of acceptance. It has that sort of new quality to it.
Yeah, I think targeting the small percentage of the population, people usually say it's like 5 to 15% that are willing to go first, that are willing to innovate, to try new things. It makes a lot of sense because you need examples, you need case studies, you need people to point to say this is normal, lots of folks are doing it, lots of folks have benefited, to get the other 85% of folks who don't want to try things that are new, who want to feel like they're just going with the flow as trends change and not the kind of trendsetters.
Do early adopters cluster at one end of the income spectrum, or do you find people who are maybe lower income, they don't have the resources, but they have the desire to try out new things?
It varies with each technology and with each region. There was some work on this done in Southern California that found that their target audience, at least one of them, was homes with multiple, like 5 people or more, so families with children, women, Latino families, folks with couples that were over 40 years of age. So they found like certain segments that seemed to be more interested, more willing to try new things.
Some more questions out there.
Could you say again how to access that LBL report?
Yeah, it's drivingdemand.lbl.gov. And another website you guys might want to know about is Energy Upgrade California, which if you want to do an upgrade to your home, has information about rebates and contractors to contact.
Some more questions out there? I think we need to turn the mic on.
Hello. Hi.
There you go.
So 2 questions. The first one is a little smaller. It's if we have about half the people in this country who own houses or something like that, but the other half rent. So what's really being done to help people who are renting?
Yeah.
And as sort of a tie into that question, what additional problems are there in more urban settings to achieving efficiency than in more suburban and rural areas?
Yeah, really good question. So this question about renters and split incentives, especially if the building owner is going to pay for the improvements, but the person renting is actually paying the utility bill. Huge issue. So it depends. In urban areas, way greater concentration of multifamily units. A lot of those are renters, right? So that's a huge split. It's a really, really hard problem, and not one that we figured out in any sort of, I think, satisfying way. One thing is that a lot of low-income folks live in rental units. More low-income folks live in rental units than in any of the other income groups. And so we need to be giving, I think, free and subsidized services to make sure those are just being done. In Boulder, they have an interesting program where it's called their Smart Reg. So they're actually requiring all multifamily buildings to make improvements by 2018. So they've set a deadline. The standard is actually, in terms of what they have to meet, the different qualifications, is actually fairly low. But what they're finding is that as soon as these building owners go through the program, figure out their rating, they're actually making improvements even if they already would have been able to pass through the programs. And part of that is they're offering incentives at the same time. The other part of that is that those folks are finding out about things they didn't know about in their buildings and are seeing some value in having better, these are good things that are good for the structure in addition to good for their bills. Another example of reaching renters, there's another program in Kansas where they have repayment of improvements on the utility bill. And so in a case where a renter is paying the utility bill, they'd be paying a portion of that. And they found in that program that about 15% of their program participants are rental units, and about 15% of the total population of homes are rental units. So they're actually having a good proportion of that population participate. They're really careful to make sure that those landlords aren't, replacing granite countertops and getting higher rental values and then putting it on the bill. They're very careful to make sure it's only certain improvements that they know are going to save folks energy on their bills. So there's a few interesting things going on around the country, but nothing that kind of broadly addresses that issue of split incentives.
Marian, some of the people in the audience here are maybe even high school students or college interns who are thinking about their careers. I'm always kind of curious when I talk to people at the lab how you got to this path, particularly in a subject where there's a certain amount of idealism infused in the whole notion of saving energy and saving the world. How did you get to this field?
Yeah, I mean, after college, I was working more with small businesses on local economic development, and decided that I wanted to know something in particular. So I went back to grad school. And for me, energy efficiency actually combines, environmental issues, economic development issues. It connects to this whole web of infrastructure that's required for both economic development and for providing services to folks. And it's supposedly the low-hanging fruit, but it has all these really interesting facets that are both, there's the financial piece of it, where how do you get capital to this market? How do you get trillions of dollars of money to make massive investments in our building infrastructure, which is aging? And on the other hand, the sort of human side of it, where individuals have to be motivated to make decisions that, and these decisions are competing with a ton of other things, and how do you make that appealing? So to me, it's both an intellectual, interesting challenge, and buildings are like 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions and 40% of our energy use. So it's big enough to be exciting.
Were you drawn? You grew up in Oakland.
Yeah.
Were you drawn to this? As a young girl growing up in Oakland, did you think that this is a direction you wanted to go, or was it until you were in college that you started to think in the terms of the career path you're on right now?
I mean, growing up, I was interested in environmental issues for sure, but not necessarily in efficiency. I hadn't connected the two by a long shot. So it was really through school that I learned about those connections.
We have way in the back in the orange shirt or red shirt.
with the switch towards single issue retrofit measures, talking to somebody about a drafty bedroom or a leaky window or something like that, and then improving that, then that brings to my mind the issue of rebound effects, and those are particularly problems in residential efficiency measures, and it seems like they might even be more so a problem if you're selling an efficiency retrofit based upon a single issue. Can you speak to that and a little bit of the research that you've seen?
There's a lot of conflicting research on this, and certainly a lot of opinion out there about rebound effect. In fact, many folks at the lab have been involved in those discussions. The basic idea is that if people, are able to get energy more cheaply because it takes less money to heat the room, maybe they'll turn the thermostat up. Maybe they'll do other things that will use more energy. I think that this is a particularly interesting issue when you're working with lower income households, where a lot of them actually have been very uncomfortable and literally have not turned their furnace on because they know it goes right outside. And so you see rebound effect, particularly in that market, I think for really good reasons, right? You're helping people not be really, really cold and uncomfortable, or really, really hot and uncomfortable, who couldn't afford it before because they were just losing the energy when they turned it on. In general, a lot of programs are focused on not just provide a well-trained contractor that kind of has this whole home solution. They're doing insulation, air sealing, HVAC upgrades, this whole solution. They're also talking to folks about energy use more broadly. And even though saving energy is not I don't think it's their number one driver, it's always part of it. And so really good contractors will connect the dots for folks. And we can't control how much energy people use. If they want to be way hotter or way colder or whatever, we can't control that. But at least with physical improvements to their house, they can get to whatever level they're trying to get to much more cheaply and with less energy use. And with a little bit of education about not wasting energy through vampire loads, through lighting, through all the other things that are going on in a house, it seems in most cases, on average, we are saving energy rather than rebound effect chewing up too much of that savings.
We have time for just a few more questions. Right there.
I had a question about consumption. Our identity is in large part defined as a consumer. We call ourselves consumers. We associate increased consumption with well-being and happiness. Marketing was born out of a need to drive wants. And then even in terms of purchasing things, when we want to spend our money, we want things that people can see, that give us social esteem. And even if you're buying photovoltaics or Priuses, those give esteem. But these upgrades, they're not visible. So is that an inherent impediment to marketing something? Because you're marketing the absence of consumption.
Yeah, it's the age-old problem of efficiency. You have nothing to show, right? It's like we're using less of something that you can't see. It's a huge problem, and it's one of the reasons things like solar and Priuses and things like that are bought as status symbols in many cases do well, even though the economics might not work out. There are a lot of people trying to think through this problem. How do you make it more visible? Some programs, as I mentioned, they have these yard signs. Others are like a little golden seal that you could put on your door. Others, my rating, if you can rate your house, my rating is a 10 and yours is only a 6, sort of thing. So it starts to become more of a social norm to think in those terms. I also think that just needs to be a practical decision that everyone makes. Like it can't be, I don't know that efficiency is ever going to be like the shining star, look at the cool new thing I did. I'm hoping it becomes like a practical home improvement. Like, yes, I make sure my ducts are not blocked, and I change my filter in my, in my furnace, and yeah, I have insulation, don't you? I think we need to get there as a society.
Marketing the absence of consumption. I like that. And you're trying to sell the fruit that's not even low-hanging, it's on the ground.
Yeah.
Right.
Who wants the fruit on the ground? It's kind of gross.
Perhaps one more question? Here we go.
You said that buildings are 40%. That means there's 60%. What lessons can transfer to like the transportation sector or the industrial sectors?
Yep, really good question. In terms of the work that we did, I think many of the behavioral insights around, we're more sensitive to losses than gains, and we tend to overestimate, that we're above average. We don't like to have multiple decisions. We get confused. There's a lot of behavioral insights in the research we did that are going to be really relevant to, for example, transportation, which is a huge nut to crack. And in California, it's way bigger as a percentage of our greenhouse gas emissions than in many other states. Also a much more difficult nut to crack because of the convenience. And you've got convenience, you've got social, there's all these sort of linked things in terms of transportation, both using public transportation and using other forms of transportation than what we currently use. Really, really difficult. But I think especially in California, that's what we need to work on, and it's going to take a lot of those behavioral insights and probably a lot else as well to get us to change the dial on that one.
As we wrap up here, I want to remind you that next week, at this very spot, at this same time, I'm going to be in conversation with Henrik Schiller, who is a vice president for feedstocks at J-Bay, and he's a plant biochemist who will be explaining some of the science of improving plants so that they become better feedstocks for biofuel. We're out of time, but I certainly felt this time went very quickly because this is a very interesting topic. We had an excellent guest, and I would like you all to give a hand to Marian Fuller for a very informative presentation today.
Thanks.